Welcome to the John Ames reading series. Tonight we have with us Richard Duggin. Richard Duggin is a professor in the Writers' Workshop at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. In 1982, his novel, The Music Box Treaty, was published by Abattoir Press. He has also edited Annex 21, Number 2, and is instrumental in the organization of the reading series, which is ongoing at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He is currently the fiction editor of the Nebraska Review. Please welcome Richard Duggin.
Thank you very much. I'll place this without spilling it. I suppose if I put it there, everybody can watch it and wait for it to go over. It'll keep your attention for a while. Thank you for coming out in such a miserable night, such bitter cold, and I guess in keeping with the spirit and the words of the Master, wherever two or three of you should gather, there will be a fiction reading. So, as advertised, I'll be reading tonight for you a story that, for you page counters, it's 34 pages long. So it'll take roughly an hour, so I'm not going to belabor it with a long introduction. Its subject and its circumstance, I think, are self-evident in the story itself as I read it. I will say that what prompted it, I guess, is a series of other stories I've been working on prior to this and published, in which I was looking at the nature of relationships between people and how we come to know or not to know, things particular about other individuals, or certain, how the impossibility, I guess, of ever coming to know another individual totally, and what that does, the ramifications of that when one's in an intimate relationship with someone. That got me fascinated with the idea of knowledge per se, how we transmit it, and the questions that arise, particularly from the standpoint, and there are a number of us that are associated with the academic community, standpoint of teaching. How do you know what you've taught, and how do you know what people have learned, and what is the nature of relationship between a teacher and a student? So out of that came the story that I'll read you tonight, and it is called, somewhat presumptuously, but in terms of the nature of the conflict, I think appropriately, The Great Teacher. Perhaps it was a mistake. The president's secretary may have taken the wrong name from the faculty directory when she addressed the envelope. Wasn't there another Howell, a new woman in foreign languages? He'd noticed her name for the first time above his own in this year's campus phone book. But she was too new. There would scarcely have been time to review her performance for her second-year reappointment, let alone assess her merits for an award such as this. Maybe it was a practical joke then, some sort of capricious display by the president of his power, using Howell to prove a point of administrative prerogative. Years ago, he had judged a poetry contest sponsored by the university's literary journal. He had come upon an entry by a woman from some hill town in West Virginia whose poems were so obviously inappropriate, pure greeting card doggerel, that he had wondered in horror what sort of pitiful optimism had compelled her to submit them. The thought had struck him that he had within his purview as final judge the power to reach out, deus ex machina, and declare her the winner of what was at that time one of the more prestigious awards in contemporary literature. He toyed with the image of her opening her rural mailbox to find the letter of acceptance and a check for $250. At that moment of her praise be to Jesus joy would come the simultaneous discrediting of the magazine, which had become the rather stuffy arbiter of poetic taste in the Midwest. With hindsight, he might just as well have acted on his cynical impulse, because the country's economy had ultimately brought the magazine to ruin anyway. But he suspected the president had no more courage for the practical joke than he. For some reason, which his intuition warned him not to pursue, Leland Howell was being unearthed from the tombs of senior faculty for near posthumous recognition. The president's letter had been delivered to the department office with the morning mail. Dear Dr. Howell, it is my pleasure to inform you of the action taken by the Board of Regents at their April meeting approving your selection for the Great Teachers Award. It is an honor which you share this year with Dr. Carl Umscheid. This award is granted in recognition of your outstanding achievement as an educator, and it signifies the esteem in which you are held by students, peers, and the administration of this institution for your dedicated service. There was more. There were the rewards, a $1,500 stipend, a plaque, the public presentation at the May commencement exercises just 3 weeks away. The letter had trembled in his hands when he first read it. It wasn't pleasure which caused the tremor. It was a darker emotion, rising up from the sickbed of despair which had blunted his days since Helen's death in January. It surprised him that he still had the capacity for strong feeling of any sort. The president's announcement had arrived 3 months late of redeeming Helen's faith that the university must inevitably recognize her husband's worth. She had died still waiting for the vindication of the years spent with him in that inhospitable climate which had brittled her spirit each year beyond the ability of the short warming seasons to rejuvenate her. Now, seated at his desk with his chair drawn up to the narrow alley between haphazard edifices of books and folders stacked around him, he imagined Carl Umscheid sitting in his own office in Mackenzie Hall across the quadrangle, reading an identical letter in which only the salutation was changed and Leland's name substituted in the second sentence. He knew Umscheid. They had sat on the faculty senate together several years ago. Carl should be feeling the elation Leland might have felt even as little as 10 years ago. Perhaps he would be picking up his telephone right now to call home and share the good news with his wife. For Umscheid, a young biologist in his 30s, the award was propitious, coming mid-career to reinforce his choice of profession. But what could it mean to Leland Howe? Why would the university nod toward him now, after 35 years, when he had little left to offer? He had understood that nominations for the honor included endorsements from students as well. But no one among the board and benighted in his undergraduate classes would ever recommend him. Certainly none of those who filled out those silly computerized evaluation forms at the end of each semester. On a scale of 1 to 5, Leland Howe consistently scored 3s in those categories which reflected their opinions of the quality of his courses and of their instruction. In a generation of television literacy, one had to have a gimmick like the snake oil media men to capture the fancy of the undergraduate student these days. An associate professor named Munson in the physics department conducted his freshman class like a magic show. He dressed in a cape and opera hat while he demonstrated the magic of gravity, energy, and matter. Munson had won Great Teacher 2 years ago. Even his graduate students were distant now, more nervous around him than usual. His colleagues were merely polite. Finding him humorless, they withheld laughter they once shared with him in halls and offices. No jokes around Leland Howe now. No have you heard lampoons of the latest interoffice from the dean. But he preferred their distance. He was grateful for their deference to his necessary privacy. He set the letter aside, then made a note on his desk calendar to call the campus bookstore and reserve a cap and gown for commencement. But even this act of deferring an act seemed to annoy him. His calendar was not so filled with things to be accomplished that this was just one more on the list waiting its turn. He recognized at once his pettiness. It was that he did not want anyone to think for a minute he was eager. He did not want them to think he was a man who sat in his office waiting for someone to recall his presence on a campus he had inhabited for more years than most of them had been around. What was really irritating him was that he was being forced now to decide on a matter of principle. Did he accept the award without feeling the honor, or did he refuse the award and lose the stipend? Matters of principle were easier to defend when you were Carl Umscheid's age. At Leland's age, there was little to defend that didn't create resentment or loss. The electronic carillon tolled from the campanile in the center of the quadrangle, and Leland quit his desk to spend his noon hour taking the sun on the mall. It was a new practice for him, begun when the first mild days of April stirred in him at last the need for some kind of activity to burn away the lethargy of his depression. He'd stopped going to lunch to accommodate his new diversion. This had caused him to lose a bit of the sluggish weight which had paunched him over the years. Helen had tried to get him to exercise, fearful for him of the dangers of heart attack, stroke, the other calamities which prey on the sedentary aging. Her own figure had escaped all that gathering and settling of gravity until her last days, when her belly seemed to pool the flesh that slid away from her bones like a false pregnancy. Now Leland looked more after his own health than he ever did in the spendthrift years his wife had worried about him. Outside in the warming sunlight, he stood at the top of the stone steps to the entrance to Griffith Hall and watched the flow of students along the mall. There seemed so many of them suddenly, young men and women in the ease of their limber bodies, books under an arm or crammed in a nylon backpack slung from one shoulder, all heading toward some point in time and space, their destinations locked in their gates as if they were bred to be on the move. The smell of flowering on the air, the bursts of blossom and leaf on the shrubs and trees along the mall, the overtakings and passings by of youth and motion, all this kinesis had brought him up short. He hadn't experienced it this way since his first years of teaching. A fear of the students in the way he feared people of a foreign tongue, their power of language to exclude him. His ignorance of their lives effaced him. Abruptly, Leland descended the steps of Griffith Hall and plunged into the stream of people coursing the walkway along the mall. At the head of the walk that branched off to Mackenzie Hall, he moved off his usual route and followed the walk into the cool recesses of the stone building that housed the university's Museum of Natural History. He discovered some time ago that the museum was a sanctuary from his thoughts. He did too much thinking lately. Mackenzie seemed a place in which he could suspend time without wasting it. And even better than the library, it was never crowded. By the end of an hour, he had wandered through the Hall of Dinosaurs, had paid his respects to the phylogenetic artifacts of man on the North American continent, had stood in proper wonder beneath the reconstructed skeleton of a great blue whale suspended from the ceiling of the large mammal hall. The time remaining to him before he had to return to his office and gather his notes for class, he spent among the glassed exhibits of smaller mammals, otter and beaver, weasel, bobcat, and fox. In the wall at the far end of the room was a diorama of a northern woods in autumn, in which several tree limbs angled from a lower to an upper corner of the case. In the crotch of two limbs, a raccoon pointed like a fat bird dog at a blue jay on a branch above. The jay, its wings spread as if for balance, seemed to lunge down at the raccoon. Its beak opened in a soundless shriek. On the leaf-strewn ground below was a porcupine, eternally gnawing the bark of a maple sapling, its black-tipped quills poking through the coarse hair. The whole scene was one of those precious moments in nature which only occur in the imaginations of cartoonists and diorama designers. But it caught Leland's attention with a sudden collision of the present perception and some felt instant from his past. He was overwhelmed momentarily by a rush of nostalgia. There was something in the scene itself, perhaps the way it was illuminated to create the illusion of cool autumn light, or the reticulation of branches and leaves in a pattern matching some subconscious matrix of memory, which caused the confused and sad notion in him that it was he who was encased by glass and his freedom lay on the other side in the timeless woodland setting. He hadn't time to reconcile the odd sensation before a young woman and a little girl who had been making their way around the room from display to display stopped now beside him. "Look at Marlene." The woman pulled the girl closer to her side and stooped to point at the level of the child's eyes. "There's a prickly porcupine." "Does he bite?" The girl's question was without the conviction of fear. "Oh, I'm sure. Look at those mean yellow teeth. He could give you a nasty bite. And if you got too close to him, he'd shoot his stickers into you. See them all poking out of him like needles?" The girl drew back. "Can he shoot them now?" No, not him. He's stuffed. But a real one would do it if you got too close. He'd stick you like a pincushion. The woman poked her finger into the child's ribs, and the child let out in a moderate squeal. Mommy, don't! She squirmed away from her mother's encircling arm when the woman laughed. It was none of Leland's business. The mother was only teasing, making her daughter's time at the museum a trifling more exotic by scaring her with animal superstition. But for some reason, he was bothered by the woman's ignorance of the way the porcupine used the defensive weaponry of its quills. That's not entirely accurate, he said suddenly, a testiness in his voice he hadn't really intended. Pardon? The woman looked up at him with dark, startled eyes. What you told your little girl, Leland said, is not entirely accurate about the way the porcupine communicates its quills. The porcupine can't shoot its quills, not even an inch. She would have to touch him or come close enough to his tail for him to swat her with it before she'd get stuck. The woman had straightened, and the moment's anxiety at being accosted by a strange man seemed to have passed. Are you positive about that? She said. The little girl, who was about 4, regarded Leland benignly. But her mother bristled like the porcupine in question. That's not what I was told. It's a common belief, but mistaken all the same, he said, softening. What difference did it make, after all? In all probability, neither the woman nor the girl would ever get close enough to a live porcupine to test the truth of their myth. And children needed a few dark mysteries in their world yet, before it shrank into rationality under the siege laid to their minds by dispassionate educators. But Leland felt committed to his lesson now. It was a failing of his that he would not be contradicted in matters about which he was certain. You have to touch or be touched by the porcupine to get stuck by a quill. You can't see them from here, he said, bending to look more closely at the display behind the glass, trying to draw the woman's attention to it the way he would a student's to the chalkboard. But on the end of each of those black-tipped spines is a series of little barbs, like those on a fish hook. And when they pierce the skin, they hold fast, and the quill pulls out of the animal's skin. Probably feels to him like it feels to you when you pull a hair out of your head. She would have none of it. Where did you get such information? She asked with sudden primness. You could find it at any encyclopedia, I suspect, he said, or any book on North American mammals. He was begging the question. At the moment, he hadn't the faintest idea where he had learned his facts. Well, there must be more than one kind of porcupine, then, because ever since I was a little girl, I've known that they can shoot their quills. And where did you get your information, he asked. From my mother. She was born and raised in Maine, where they have porcupines. Oh, they have them in Minnesota, too, he said, the same kind as in Maine. Your mother, I'm afraid, was misinformed. The woman looked down at her own daughter, who was staring into the display at the scolding blue jay. Perhaps there's a curator around, she said, turning half about to survey the room, empty except for the 3 of them, or someone else who could settle this. Leland was dismayed by the thought of being detained here while she sought another opinion. My dear woman, he said quickly, with proper disdain, I am the curator. She looked at him then, confused, a last flicker of anger in her eyes before she shifted them back to the little girl. The color rose at the base of her throat. Oh, she said. Well, you may be right. It was so long ago. She took the girl's hand and pulled her away from the glass window, and the 2 of them set off for the far end of the hall, the girl trotting to keep up with her mother's percussive footsteps across the tiled floor. The lie had come so easily, his cowardice concealed behind usurped authority. The woman had been too quick to accept it. She was like his students, who semester after semester accepted the authority of his assertions about the artistic intentions of writers long dead. Why did they do that? Because his hair was white and he wore a tie and suit coat? Because he stood like a priest behind the intractability of his own dogma? Or was it simply because he stood? Because he drew himself erect above their bent heads, his hands gripping the edges of the lectern, from behind which he delivered, almost by rote now, the accumulated notes of years as a lecturer. He was one of the last professors to lecture formally, where nearly everyone else slouched in chairs or perched on the edges of tables to exchange views, discuss alternative modes of thought, or rap about knowledge in an egalitarian travesty of Socratic method. Perhaps this was his gimmick then, his cape and opera hat attention grabber. Leland Howe was a great teacher because he was one of the few remaining old ducks who still professed to know more than his students. That evening, his daughter Beth called long distance from Seattle. "Dad, you don't sound too good. Do you have a cold?" she asked after they had been talking for a minute. "Are you taking your vitamin C?" "Save that for your husband and children," he said. "I'm fine. I'm 63 years old, and I think I can pretty well take care of myself by now." "Well, you always could," she said, and he wondered if that were true. "No, I thought your voice sounded a bit gravelly when you answered." "It's the connection," he said. "It's my age. The vocal cords rattle more when you're older, like everything else. You just haven't heard me speak for 3 weeks." "I know. I'm sorry. We've been so busy up here with the kids' school events and the spring party circuit, I haven't had time to breathe. John's away for the weekend down in San Francisco for a conference of electrical engineers. It's the first moment I've had without having to be somewhere in a month." "I wasn't being critical," he said. "Really. You concern yourself too much about me as it is. Everything's fine here. It's spring and the crocuses are blooming, and there are only 3 more weeks before I lock up my office on another year and try to get away to the lake for some well-deserved fishing." "I remember the crocuses," she says, "and the wisteria by the garage. The blossoms are big as clusters of grapes this year," he said. "I don't mean to make a pest of myself. I'm not spying on you, Daddy," she said. For an instant, he heard her as he remembered it when she was 9 or 10, and her voice carried to him thinly across the water from the dock to the little rowboat where he sat in the stillness of early morning with his line at the edge of the pickerel weed. "Come get me, Daddy. I'm ready." "I guess I just still miss Mum," she said. She was saying now. "Yes, I know," he said. "We all do." He thought about telling her of the award. It would be a bit of news to make her call seem justified. It would make her feel better, pleased for him. But he couldn't bring it to words just yet. "Listen," he said, "this is costing you money needlessly. We can write each other just as well." And then, so as not to seem too harsh, he added, "I appreciate your calling, really. Do you think you might come out this summer? The kids would love to see you. They need to see their grandfather more often." Before it's too late, did she mean? He could hear them now, realized he had been hearing them all along in the background. Tracy's whine and Doug's intense piping laugh. The idea of their littleness, all that curious energy waiting to explode into laughter or injury, was more than he could handle at the moment. "I might do that," he said, "but first I'm going to take some time out for myself. Unless I do, I don't think I'd be very good company." "I hardly consider you company, Dad. You haven't lived with me now for 12 years. I'm company, believe me." He lived among boxes now. In the past 3 months, he had been packing things away. At first, it had been boxes containing Helen's clothes, which Beth had filled during the week she'd spent with him after the funeral, taking for herself, at his insistence, some of her mother's personal things, jewelry and scarves, china and bric-a-brac for keepsakes. She had cleaned out Helen's closet in the bedroom, the wardrobe in the basement, her things in the hall closet. All her cosmetics had gone from the bathroom. "It's the only way to do it," his daughter had said. "And then you must promise you'll call up the Salvation Army or the disabled vets and have them come pick them up. Grief is complicated enough without constant reminders every time you open a drawer or a closet door." He had promised. But the carton still remained stacked in the garage. Recently, he had begun packing away many of his own things as well. Clothes he no longer fancied, tools from the workbench, linens, even some of his files and books. He knew he would have to move out of the house altogether one day, perhaps this summer. The thought of only his presence there complicated his loneliness with a feeling he was in some way betraying her each day he remained. Last fall, she had confessed to him that her greatest wish of late was to live in the desert when they retired. "I can't take many more winters here, Dr. Howell. They're decimating me," she said. I want to live out my days in a place where things don't rust. It was neither complaint nor ultimatum, but a sudden escape of thought that seemed to him at the moment a non sequitur. They had not been talking about the weather. They were walking to the milk store for an ice cream cone just to be out in the pale sunlight of a warm October afternoon admiring the turn of leaves. That was before either of them knew, although he realized later her body must have been sending its first lethal message to her. It was as though once she'd admitted aloud her wish for change, it became her most compelling need. Just this once more, Leland, she said, with the first snow in November. And she had caved into the inconveniences of their environment, turning them into intolerables. He hadn't known her to press for anything for herself in the 42 years of their marriage. It was so uncharacteristic of her to express any sort of pain that he had become alarmed. And because he admitted to himself some years before that he had undoubtedly achieved all he was going to in his life, there would be no more except more of the same, he let her know that they would not have to wait the 8 more years until he would retire or be required to retire. He would keep his eyes open for a position in a Southwest school that might come close to matching his skills with their needs. They hadn't made plans like this since they'd made the move from Syracuse to Minnesota 34 years before. Once they decided they would risk it, they had to caution each other now to be careful about expecting too much, to play it safe so as not to put themselves in the way of disappointment that might snap the fragile notion that they were still free to take risks. But all the same, he had felt buoyant himself with the prospect of new beginnings. He found the opening in the American Literature Society's Bulletin of Vacancies. A community college near Tucson needed someone to teach 2 sections of composition, an American Literature Survey course, and another course in an unspecified area. The announcement simply read, plus a second period course. Leland recognized it as one of those utility positions in a department whose function was primarily to service students majoring in other disciplines. But it would be a position which offered no pressure, and it seemed an appropriate way to ease himself out of the academic paper mill before he retired to his own long-delayed research project on Frederick Goddard Tuckerman. He applied for the opening, sending a 6-page vita and selected copies of some of his articles. Then he waited, assuring Helen that, yes, he had sent everything necessary to adequately represent him. Only someone looking for an instructor of mechanical engineering might fail to recognize the strength of his credentials in American letters. You're being too smug about it, she said. Why didn't you include letters from your colleagues? Every application has letters of recommendation. I gave them names to contact if they're serious about me. I don't want to alarm anyone here until I'm sure they want us. People are going to think I've taken leave of my senses as it is. Perhaps you're not so sure yourself, she said pettishly. Maybe you think it's not a good thing for your career. Are you doing this only to please me? Any way you look at it, he said, my career is over in 8 years. I might as well finish my time in a place that makes you happy as to wait around here. Retiring in Minnesota won't buy us any more food stamps in our dotage. My God, Dr. Howell, she cried, if they think you're coming down there to retire, they'll never take you. Leland had felt pleased, quickened by the first bit of adventure they'd brought to their lives in years. Dear, if I were the chairman of the department at Sonora Community College, and I received an application from someone with a Ph.D. from Columbia who had taught at Dartmouth, Syracuse, and Minnesota, the first thing I might wonder is whether he got caught exposing himself to young co-eds in his class. But once I determined he wasn't being fired for moral turpitude, I suspect I'd hire him instantly, if for no other reason than the novelty of having such an old dinosaur from the Kaplan gang of critics on my staff. Think of Max Kaplan's biographer teaching freshman compositions to students in Sonora. I am, Helen replied. They'll never buy it. Don't worry, he said. We'll be hearing from them. He had been right. Several weeks later, Leland received the letter from an El Ruggiero department head. They were pleased to receive his application. Naturally, they were impressed by his vita. Did he realize the position was for someone at a junior rank, and that the salary, while negotiable to a limit, would undoubtedly fall well below what he was presently earning? The letter concluded, However, if you are planning to attend the ALS annual meeting in New York in December, I will be pleased to interview you there on behalf of our search committee. I will be staying at the conference headquarters in the Americana Hotel. Until the letter, he hadn't planned to attend the ALS conference. He hadn't attended one since he was last invited to deliver a paper at the conference in Denver in 1968. That was the year Max Kaplan died, and Leland's paper had become a eulogy in praise of Kaplan's influence on the shape and direction of American letters since the 1930s. Helen had driven him to the airport just ahead of another winter storm, the third already that season, and by the time he arrived in New York and called home, she told him they were in the middle of a blizzard. "Don't bicker about salary, Dr. Howell. We'll make up the difference of what we save on heating alone," she said good-humoredly. But he had heard a swift of desperation knifing through her voice. Early Saturday afternoon, in the hour before the interview, he sat on a divan in the main lobby of the hotel and watched conventioners and hotel guests wander by the little pit of couches between the registration desks and the gift shop. Teachers, salesmen and saleswomen, a noisy busload of high school students on a class trip, all swept by him without his seeing any of them a second time. It was as if he were a fixed point along the line of their origins and destinations, the only immutable against which to measure the progression of transient lives. He felt detached then, almost invisible, with a sweet sadness for what he imagined he bore within himself. He was a chalice filled with a wine none of them, strange and forever beyond him, would ever taste. Dr. Ruggiero greeted Leland at the door of his hotel room and ushered him to a chair by the window. He was a short man with a gleaming bald crown, and he moved with the harried energy of a cafe owner. "Please," he said, "have a seat. Be comfortable." This late in the afternoon, he had divested himself of coat and tie, which lay draped across the foot of the bed, and he looked altogether parboiled in his wrinkled shirt and creaseless checkered pants. "These conventions," Ruggiero said, taking a seat in a straight-backed chair in front of the vanity which served as his desk, "each year I dread them more." Except for the moments they greeted one another at the door, Ruggiero had not looked at Leland directly. "Have you been interviewing many?" "All yesterday and all today, with the exception of a couple hours this morning when I had to give a presentation," Ruggiero said, picking through file tabs in a cardboard file box full of fat manila folders. "But then we have 3 positions to fill this year. That's highly unusual, of course." He withdrew a folder from beneath another one and opened it. "Ah, here you are. Excuse me, let me get my bearings here for a moment." "Take your time," Leland said. He was aware of the scent of lavender in the air, and it took him a moment to realize that in the dead of winter in New York, it was not coming from anything naturally in bloom. It was a cologne scent, fresh and excessive. Ruggiero had probably dashed it on to brace his wilting spirit just before Leland had arrived at his door. He glanced about the room while Ruggiero read his veto. There was a closed suitcase on the webbed rack at the foot of the bed, a nearly empty pint bottle of bourbon, and 3 soiled glasses on the nightstand beside the bed. Beyond that, and the vanity cluttered with file folders, brochures, and a college catalog, it was apparent the man had spent his time so far in New York unsettled away from home. The room was still very much institutional. Leland had known a teacher once, Oliver Tackett, his undergraduate professor in Chaucer, who kept an office even more impersonal than Dr. Ruggiero kept his hotel room. There was such compulsive spareness about the furnishings and minimal tools of trade in that office that Barron better described it. It was so narrow, there was space only for a desk and bookcase along the same wall, nothing opposite. There was never more than a blotter and double pen set on the desk, and the bookcase held only as many books as he might carry to and from work each day. Altogether, the office gave Leland the impression that its occupant had not yet moved in. Although he recalled that Tackett was a fluent, almost lyrical lecturer, the only words he retained which had impressed him during the semester he spent in his Chaucer class was the professor's answer when Leland had asked him one day about the absence of furnishings. "I don't work here," was all he said. The ambiguity had not puzzled Leland. Dr. Ruggiero nodded over Leland's folder. "We were quite impressed with your credentials," he said. "We don't normally see many of this caliber applying to Sonora." Leland wasn't sure whether he should thank Ruggiero for the compliment or offer an excuse. "You've done an awful lot of graduate teaching. You understand, don't you, that Sonora is an undergraduate college, a community college. Our neighbor, the University of Arizona, is the major research institution in the area." "Yes, I understand. But you had the opening, not Arizona." He realized instantly his error, and he hastily tried to make amends. "Anyway, I have in mind the need for a different kind of teaching. I've been through my midlife crisis long ago. Lateral and upward mobility are only words to me now. I think I'd like to winter in a different emotional climate, and Sonora sounds attractively warm and peaceful." Ruggiero smiled and leaned back in his chair, looking squarely at him for the first time. "Nonetheless, you put us in a strange predicament," he said. "Most certainly our search committee was curious about you. They wanted me to have a look at you firsthand. But the energeticness of your vita suggests it's entirely possible you are overqualified for any position we might be able to offer you. Honestly, I can't see why you'd even give us a thought. The different kind of teaching you mentioned is entirely different from what you're used to." "I'm aware of that," Leland said. Ruggiero did not reply for a moment. His eyes moved to view something above Leland's head. Finally, he said, "I've interviewed 15 applicants in the past 2 days, all of them young men and women recently graduated or due to graduate in May. The ink on their degrees is still wet. They all have that hunger about them. You know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. You can see it in the way they inflate their vitae with unpublished papers and memberships on ad hoc committees to choose new textbooks for freshman comp. Anything to make them seem fatter with experience. And in a few years, they'll be searching again, hoping to attract a look from a bigger school like yours. The problem is, we couldn't possibly match the salary you're making now without cutting a position in our department. I can fill 2 of the 3 openings we have on that salary. But that's not entirely the problem either." "I know," Leland said. "You don't think you would be willing to trust someone who's climbing back down." "Well, actually, that's harsher than I would have put it," Ruggiero said. "It's more to the point that we would undoubtedly try to use your talents beyond what you'd be willing to give at this point in your career. You wouldn't find the climate all that peaceful at Sonora." He looked away again, this time down at the open folder in his right hand, or the open folder his right hand rested on. "Really, I just don't see how we could possibly offer you the job." "I understand," Leland said, almost paternally. He was feeling vaguely embarrassed, but not because he was being turned down. The whole thing was distressing him because he had made them both uncomfortable. It struck him that this poor man, at least 15 years his junior, had probably put off seeing him until the end of the list because he too was embarrassed. The cologne, that sweet, clean scent of lavender freshly applied before Leland's arrival, told him of the younger man's misery, the years of knowing the same uninspired accomplishments as he. Even now, months later, sitting in this familiar house frozen in some sort of sluggish transition of his own among the snowy bleach, Winston cigarettes, Quaker Oats cartons he and Beth had collected from the grocery store, even now he recalled that in the somnolence of that hour waiting in the lobby of the Americana, he had known he was not going anywhere. After the interview, he had returned to his room to change for dinner. As he shaved before the mirror in the bathroom, he found himself gazing at his image with that same sad detachment he had experienced all afternoon. There seemed nothing singular, nothing distinguishing in his appearance that might cause someone to remember him. No prominent nose, no mole or cleft chin, nothing at all noteworthy. Even when he stared directly into the image of his own eyes and saw the secret of impermanent flesh along the axis of his reflected sight, he felt nothing unusual in the fact of his own mortality. That was when he had wondered for the first time how he could be remembered by any of the students he had taught through all of the years of his teaching, and how it could be that if they did not remember the teacher, they could possibly remember the subject. He thought of Helen. How remarkable it seemed she would even recall him once he was out of her sight. When she came to pick him up at the airport, would she know him among the more conspicuous noses, hairstyles, scars, or limps? He hurried from the bathroom to the phone on the bedside table. Through the interminable electronic clicks connecting the distance between them, the eventual tinny ring of the phone half a country away, he had a desolate feeling he was calling from another planet. Hello? Her voice was drawn and flat, muted by the miles. Hello, dear, it's me. Oh, hi. She sounded brighter, a bit closer, and Leland felt the easing of his anxiety. She knew his voice anyway. How's it going? Nothing's wrong, is there? Nothing's wrong, he said. I just thought I'd see if everything's all right there. Just fine, she said. It's real cold here. We had snow all night last night. 11 inches, they're saying now. It's good you got off when you did. Yes, but I might as well have stayed at home. How'd it go? Well, you may be pleased to know I make too much money, and I have too much experience to be of any value any longer, he said. We'd better reconsider buying that new carpeting for the living room. No luck, huh? Her voice seemed tinged with sympathy. I'm sorry, dear. But then you really didn't want it terribly bad, did you? Not really, I mean. He saw her in his mind then, pictured through her voice the thin line of her mouth, the slack cheeks and tight gray curls of her hair over her ears. Are you very disappointed, he asked. Not if you aren't, she said. Actually, I think I'm a bit relieved. When I saw you off at the airport yesterday and thought that you might be coming back to tell me we really had to pack up and move, well, I suddenly felt quite foolish for all the fuss I'd been making. We are too old and settled, you realize, to be starting out again. It's worse than you think, he said. I would hate to be young even and starting out right now. But I'll tell you all about it when I get home tomorrow. All right, love. I'll see you at the airport at 2:30. I'll buy you a drink. I'll buy you a drink, he said. He was seized by that sudden strange doubt again. And listen, I'll be wearing my brown topcoat. The line was silent for a moment, and he thought she had hung up already. Then he heard her laugh, a surprised and warm little trill. All right, she said, but maybe just to be sure you might wear a white carnation in your lapel. Leland wondered yet if she had known when he called her that she was already invaded. Or had the moment in which she admitted to him she was asking nothing more out of her life been the end of her will to resist its claim on her. Not that, certainly, because if that's all that it took, conceding there was nothing more to living than more of the same, then it would not have been Leland Howe who was left behind to piece it all out. She must have known. It had to have been working in her even then, and she must have intuited it, that it was not just her weariness over facing another winter in Minnesota. It was over with so quickly, not more than 6 weeks from the diagnosis to her death. She refused the chemicals, the radiation, with rare belligerence. Even as rebellious as it is, this is my body, she said. Don't let them do anything like that, Leland. No poisons. Only if it gets too bad, perhaps something for the pain. If it gets too bad, I'm not very good about pain. But she didn't even require that. He could not help her even in that small way. Instead, she slipped into a coma that obliterated her last week. It was as if she had deferred to him in that, too, the way she had made her whole life a concession to him. She would not linger in her dying and ruin his semester. She seemed able to schedule it all during the holiday break between first and second term. It came to him now that it might not be for him the university was making its gesture after all. It was for her, for Helen, for his loss. The great teacher award is compensation for his life. Why else just now, if not out of charity for his grief? But if her death were the real reason, how might he tolerate it? He'd rather believe it was the correction of years of neglect, even the president's idea of a prank, than abide the affront of their pity. And since he could never really know what was in their minds, he wouldn't be able to accept the award in any event. It occurred to him all at once that he could resolve any doubt by declining the honor. First thing Monday, he'd write a letter to the president explaining his reasons, which were, He'd list them. He could work it out now on paper while it was hot in his mind. That way, he'd set the record straight for himself as well. He went to his desk in the little study off the dining ell. The room had once been a sun porch until he and Helen had it and the kitchen remodeled after Beth left for college in 1966. What were the reasons? His age was one. The award was intended as an incentive, not a retirement premium. If he hadn't the qualities of a great teacher 5 or 10 years ago when he still had the energy, then he certainly didn't possess them now when half his life was packed away in cartons and the other half was simply occupying space in a half-dead house. What were the qualities of a great teacher after all? He'd known a few in his time, damned few, and they were as different from one another as species of birds. The only common attribute they shared was that Leland remembered them still, each a poignant image sculpted from a specific moment in his life. It was seldom the remembrance of things said that fixed them in his mind, certainly not the sort of stuff their books and lectures were made of. Over the years, all of that had been assimilated into his own knowledge, and without the help of notes he had made for his own research and lectures, he could no longer be certain what to credit as theirs and what was his. Their influence, then, was not in what they had said or written. It was in what remained of them in memory after the words were gone. One such memory was of an afternoon at a cabin on a small lake outside Hanover, New Hampshire. The cabin belonged to Maxwell Kaplan, who had swept Leland Howell under wing soon after he'd graduated from Columbia and taken his first full-time position at Dartmouth College. It was a Saturday in November when he had been invited to accompany Kaplan to Crystal Lake in his Jeep to pick up some maple logs cut from a blow-down tree that summer for his fireplace in Hanover. And Leland had gone along, a young man barely over the trauma of defending his dissertation, as nervous as he was pleased by the unexpected honor. But of that entire afternoon, alone in the company of such a formidable rogue among the first modern critical theorists the universities had produced, nothing remained of what they said to each other. Although they had talked at length, Kaplan talked, Leland listened for the most part. Over the years, what stuck was a single image of the two of them leaning against the railing along the front porch of the cabin, each with a water tumbler of scotch in hand, looking at the bolus of the sun setting across the lake. Kaplan had found the bottle of scotch beside the couch in the front room, left there, he presumed, by some guest at the end-of-season party he'd given for his neighbors in the cabins on each side of his. Delighted with having discovered such a treasure, he had poured each of them a drink, and as his contribution, Leland had gone down to the lakeshore and broken some ice from the thin sheet that covered the surface and dropped a jagged piece into each glass. Kaplan wore a red and black lumberman's shirt and khaki pants, and the glare from the lake lighted in profile his phenomenal mane of white hair and that craggy nose as hooked as the beak of a bird of prey. What struck Leland about the portrait they made in that moment they stood together on the porch near the deserted shore, incommunicado with the rest of the world of scholars and students who read Kaplan's books and flocked to his lectures on campuses and at conferences to learn what he knew. What froze the memory whole and clear was the exquisite pleasure he had felt in the conspiratorial silence between them as they sipped their scotch. It seemed to him even now, with nearly 40 years to make comparison, he had not tasted anything quite as perfect as that moment, the amber alcohol that warmed it, the iridescent red sunlight as it reflected from the icy lake. It had been this way with all the important teachers in his life, this separating of the things he had learned from the people who had taught him. The facts he had accumulated were without taste or color or smell, as insubstantial as X-ray. But the people were there yet, vivid and sensual cameos he had carved of them, and they brought light to dispel the darkest areas of his ignorance. In the end, it all came down to one quality, the sum of all the others and their common denominator as well. A teacher was not the lessons he taught, but the image of himself he inspired in the one who remembered him. He thought of the woman and the little girl in the museum that afternoon. They would not remember the facts about the porcupine he'd offered unless the image of the one who had taught them became the impress for their new knowledge. That had been so for Leland with Maxwell Kaplan, with Oliver Tackett in his barren office, with Helen, with his few outstanding students. The lessons he'd learned about literature, or love, or compassion and giving, with those his memory yielded up in specific faces, gestures, instants of contact. Even as the man who had taught him about porcupines sprang clearly and unbidden to mind now, the years between like an aperture opening to light, the image of himself at 10 and of Joe Crane, his bald head mottled with freckles, gleaming in the light of a campfire at Camp Pembroke, that he should even remember the name. Joe Crane was certainly dead now, too. He was probably in his 60s when Leland knew him, the fringe of hair grown white, his thick eyebrows a dark gray. He was the camp's nature counselor, and his duties were to take the boys on hikes or campouts and to conduct a class in woodlore each day. He did so without any of the neurotic fervor of a scout leader. One got the feeling that he would have done so whether or not the boys were there. He was so much the image of what he did, easily at home in the lore which he tried to teach them. Joe Crane smoked a straight-stemmed black pipe. What had fixed that in Leland's memory was the ritual he made of lighting it. When he sat with the boys on a bark bear log in the pentagon of logs laid end to end in the clearing outside the rec hall, he would pack the pipe while he talked quietly about the mysteries of the woods. He was minus the tips of 3 fingers in his right hand. Only the first finger and thumb were intact. The others had been severed below the first joint, the skin folded over and dimpled at their nubby ends, like the gnawed stump of some paw-trapped animal. With a boy's fascination for handicap, Leland would watch the movement of Crane's right hand as it went to his shirt pocket. Pincer-like, the thumb and forefinger nipped the top of the oval red can of Prince Albert and slid it from the pocket. Then, switching hands, he'd hold the bowl of the pipe in his right, the can of tobacco in his left, flicked open the hinge top open with his thumbnail, and tipped the edge of the can to the rim of the bowl. Like something independently alive, the long forefinger of his mutilated hand probed the mouth of the can, drawing the flakes into the bowl, the tip of the finger tamping the tobacco down lightly before reaching out to beckon more in. All the while, he kept his eyes moving from face to face around the pentagon of logs, talking calmly. Only when he was ready to light the pipe did he allow his attention to be diverted. The can, with its parson cloth prints on the white oval, disappeared back into Joe's shirt pocket, and he'd extract a silver cylinder of wooden matches. Leland could still remember the tingling sensation he felt in the pads of his own fingertips while he watched Joe Crane brace the matchstick in the notch of skin at the joint of his second digit while he swept the blue sulfur head across a log to bring it up flaring on the first striking. And he recalled, along with it, the delicious sensation in his throat and chest as he watched Crane hold the burning match delicately between his forefinger and thumb and suck the flame down into the fresh tobacco. To this day, he was sure he could still make, without much thought, a lean-to shelter of pine boughs. He could see it clearly, the webbing of sticks and poles, and smell the broken needles in the cool night air. But he couldn't remember Joe Crane in the act of teaching him this bit of backwoods survival, any more than he could remember the man's lessons on the porcupine. The knowledge was there, indelibly, and if he did not get it from Joe Crane, then he had no idea where it came from. Leland crumpled the piece of paper he had taken out to write his list on. He was no longer certain what principle he was defending. There was no reason for him not to accept the award, just as there was no clear reasons for him to acknowledge it. He had gone to school for 20 years, taught for 40 years, raised a family, and he had lost his wife. There was no crucial difference between him and all the others who had never been recognized. Neither was there any commonality between him and others who had been singled out. Perhaps this was the year to commemorate the forgotten teacher. It was the award to the unknown professor. When he rose from his desk and looked beneath it, then beside it, for somewhere to throw away the crumpled paper, he could not even find the wastebasket. Somewhere among the boxes of books and file folders, he had packed away as well the refuse of his work. There was one other thing he recalled he had learned about porcupines. They were among the slowest creatures in the woods and were possessed of truly prehistoric brains. They waddled about secure in the impenetrability of their spiny defenses. For a person lost and starving in the wilderness, this could be the easiest, though not the tastiest, source of meat. One had only to run the porcupine down, easy enough even for someone weak with hunger, and with only a stout stick, he could dispatch it by a sharp blow to the nose, breaking the bones there and driving them back into its brain. Then one had only to turn the animal on its back to get at the soft, quillless skin of its belly. Leland was 15 when he was presented with the opportunity to test the truth of this bit of wood lore he had picked up 5 years before at Camp Pembroke. His family had rented a summer home in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a small acreage with a modest apple orchard near the house. Toward the end of the summer, as the apples ripened, the deer came from the woods in the early morning to feed on the windfall fruit. At night, the porcupines roosted in the trees like wild turkeys. On the first night that Leland heard them calling to each other, he thought it might be mating cats that had wandered onto the place from some nearby farm. The doleful sounds carried clearly through the open window of his bedroom, and it reminded him of the wailing of an infant. But the more they continued, the more distinct they were from cat or infant. From his window, he could see across the lawn and into the orchard. However, even though the moonlight was bright enough to cast dark shadows of the trees and shrubs, he could not make out anything moving among the apple trees. He had slipped on his pants in the dark, stuffed his feet into bedroom slippers, and hurried downstairs to the kitchen, where he grabbed a flashlight from a drawer. On the porch outside the kitchen door, he retrieved the axe handle his father had kept alongside the wood box. Whatever was out there, he could hear them calling still, their voices as brazen as if they were the only warm-blooded life about. His heart beat thickly, anticipating the moment when he would commit himself to the open expanse of moonlit lawn between the house and the orchard. But when finally he bolted away from the shadows at the corner of the house and ran heavy-footed in his floppy slippers through the grass, the noise ceased instantly. The taller grass at the edge of the orchard, in that grass, he stopped and listened into the silence. He felt certain then that whatever had been there had vanished already into the woods with that remarkable capacity for invisibility which animals seem to possess. Disappointed, he switched on the flashlight and held it at eye level as he had been taught by Joe Crane. In the tree nearest him, a pair of eyes glowed coal red against the flimsy beam of yellow light. Leland's heart was ice-shot for an instant. But in the next, he was able to distinguish the pointed head and fat black body clinging to a branch. The porcupine turned slowly about and scrabbled along the branch toward the trunk, and Leland started toward the tree for a closer look. A rustling in the grass right before him brought him up short. He shone his light down as another porcupine, even larger than the first, lumbered off in the direction of the woods. What happened then became for him, thinking about it almost 50 years later, a clear example of how we separate the things we have learned from the people who have taught us. Here was a porcupine, at large in its natural element. Here was Leland Howell, armed with a stout stick. He had not been so casual about it at the time. As he recalled it now, there were strong emotions working within him at the moment. Certainly there was some fear, because he was alone in the night among wild animals with fiercely glowing eyes who had come from the woods. But there were other feelings as well, spontaneous and more compelling, which his adolescence was not strong enough to resist. Deer hunters called it buck fever, that bloodlust that clouds judgment, races the heart, and shoots enough adrenaline into the system to make one feel crazy. The sight of the porcupine retreating to the safety of the woods brought on this sudden compulsion in Leland, and armed with a flashlight and axe handle, he gave pursuit. He closed the distance between them almost at once, outflanked the animal, and came between it and the woods. The porcupine turned about. In an ungainly rocking trot, it headed back toward the apple trees. He was all abristle, the long quills on its back standing almost upright. Using the beam of his flashlight to blind and the axe handle to prod, he had turned the porcupine about again, and then again, running around it in circles until it settled motionless, a ball of spines, waiting for Leland to take a foolhardy bite. It may be that he thought it would be a clean and simple thing. A tap on the porcupine's nose with his axe handle, and the animal would be dead without pain to either of their psyches. But it did not present its nose. It did not present much of its head that Leland could see. The first blow of the axe handle, at the angle he had from above and behind his quarry, caught the animal on its back and shoulders, sounding a hollow, rattling thump like striking a melon in a brush pile. The porcupine recoiled, thrashing its tail twice to warn him away, and then it was off again, wobbling as it ran. He leapt after and struck again, another rattling blow that left several quills stuck in the end of the handle. The porcupine didn't stop. Leland overtook it, leapt over its back at the crucial instant, turned on his heel, and swung the handle again. The force of the blow rolled the porcupine. Another quick swing, and Leland heard bone crunch. But again, the porcupine righted itself and continued on, blindly. In the beam of his flashlight, Leland saw the blood on the axe handle and felt it like dew on the soles of his feet before he had realized he had run out of his slippers. He didn't count the blows that it took. He only knew he was committed to kill what was now wounded, the fever souring in his blood, provoking a wretchedness of heart at having begun something he had not the least desire to finish. Frightened and raged, he let the axe handle rain upon the injured animal, finally stopping its motion, then simply beating the quivering body, which turned softer, mushier, as bones were pulverized. It seemed for the longest time he heard a gurgling whistle of air escape like a muted cry, and it was this which he demanded to still with each swing. When finally there was silence and he stood over the dead porcupine in the moonlight between two apple trees, panting from the exertion, it occurred to him that all he had wanted to know was what was making the noise in the orchard. He retrieved his flashlight from where he had dropped it when he had taken the axe handle in both hands to increase the power of his swing, and he shone it on the carcass. The flattened grass around it was littered with quills and glistened with jewels of blood. He was startled by a sudden noise, a scratching on bark in the nearest tree. With a weak cry of alarm, he shot his light up into the branches. The second porcupine stared back at him. When he moved the light to the next tree, he spotted two more of them, and farther down the row, another one. In all, there were four, each one caught in turn by the yellow beam of light, their red eyes fixed on him. The following Monday, there was a note from Carl Umscheid in the department mail congratulating him. I would like to believe they picked the two most obvious candidates, the note said, but in my case it comes as a real surprise. I can't imagine what I'm doing right beyond what I've always done, or better than any of my colleagues. Even taking into account the younger man's mannered humility, Leland sensed there was honesty in Umscheid's perplexed statement. On his way to his morning class, he was stopped by several of his own colleagues in the department who offered their congratulations. The department chairman, Jonathan Kroger, caught up with him at the elevator to shake his hand. Something like this is good for the whole department, he said. It's about time they recognize the English faculty has outstanding teachers, too. So now he was a team player, the standard bearer for an entire department. In his morning survey class, Leland's students looked at him as impassively as ever, shifted uncomfortably, and watched the clock while the great teacher-elect delivered as usual a 50-minute lecture, neither dull nor entertaining, with the authority of someone totally familiar with his subject. There were 75 students in his class. He had at his disposal 2 graduate assistants to grade their exams and read the 3 critical papers assigned to them for the semester. Nevertheless, after class, he called the bookstore to reserve a cap and gown for commencement. Outside the office window, a light rain was falling. The noon carillon began its 10-minute concert, and routinely, Leland left his desk to take his walk on the mall. Before he remembered, he had left his umbrella on the back seat of the car this morning. He stood at the window for a time, trying to gauge the density of the rainfall, his chances of going even to the cafeteria in the student center without getting soaked through his suit coat. Along the walkway 3 stories below, the hourly tide of student traffic seemed little more hurried than on a clear day. Although umbrellas blossomed like mushroom caps among the greater number of uncovered heads drifting past. For a moment gazing down, he felt himself move along with them. The rain fell on his own bare head, but without discomfort. The dampness was a balm, and the skin on his face tingled with coolness. But even as he experienced this odd stirring of spirit, he could hear Helen's voice admonish him, as she used to mind his health, dress for the weather. Only the image he saw was not the Helen who once said such things, the small, cheerful woman with a bird's energy and razor wit. It was that last image of her, unconscious, strung with plastic tubes like a slack marionette, her life percolating through them while he sat in a chair at the foot of her bed and watched her open mouth for some final word to make it all clear to him. A student of her death waiting for the end of class summation. Before he left the office, he looked up the number for the Salvation Army. He called and made arrangements with the pleasant-voiced woman who answered to have the truck come by the house on Wednesday and pick up a number of boxes and bags of clothing and other items. On the mall, Leland walked with the students, the rain spotting his gray suit and dampening his hair. The carillon was playing an etude. Its electronic tones pealed with the bronze clarity of the real thing. Peter Todd, a violin teacher in the music department, had once told him that the technology now existed to electronically duplicate the sounds of virtually any instrument. I have a trained ear, he'd said, but listening to a recording of synthesized violins, I can't tell the difference. The programmed synthesizer in Corbine Hall and the yellow brick campanile which housed the speakers on the mall were a gift from the Alumni Association after the death of Malcolm Townley had stilled the real bells in the Tower of Corbine in 1977. For 25 years, Townley had played the bells every weekday at noon, following a line of others who had kept the tower before him. Now, except for a rare holiday concert given by the department's organist, or on the occasion of a football victory, the old bells were silent. There was no importance any longer in Townley's daily ritual. And Townley's name was not among the great teachers of the university either. Howell went to the cafeteria in the student center, where he ordered a bowl of soup, a ham sandwich, and a salad. He sat at a table with 2 of his colleagues from English and several others from history and sociology. They talked of small matters having to do with summer plans, the upcoming faculty senate picnic, the Democratic caucuses. And Leland, who did not say much at all, felt nonetheless at ease and a part of the gathering. On his way back to Griffith Hall, he stopped off at the Natural History Museum in Mackenzie Hall. He was curious to see if the exhibit with the porcupine might conjure again that queer sensation he'd had before he was interrupted by the woman and her little girl. He suspected now it was a recollection of Joe Crane that was the latch he had been about to spring. But in a way, he hoped it wasn't. The impression of temporal displacement, when he had been seized by that clear intuition of the past in fusion with the present, was still seductive to him. The museum was busier than it had been on the previous Friday. It may have been that people were drawn in to escape the rain. There were at least a dozen of them in the small mammal room alone, and Leland was disappointed to find a young man and his girlfriend blocking the view of the exhibit he wished to study. They stood holding hands, their shoulders touching, looking silently through the glass at the three stuffed figures, while Leland waited behind them, impatient as someone with a thirst waiting behind the glutton at the water fountain. But when finally they did move, and he had taken their place before the window, whatever he had hoped to rediscover for himself had fled the moment. While it was the same exhibit, nothing was quite the same as before. His eyes detected now the source of the autumn light and a yellow bulb recessed in the top of the case. The blue jay's wings were moth-eaten at the shoulders. The raccoon's paws were visibly wired to the tree limb. Only the porcupine seemed real yet, out of place in the artificial setting, as if at any instant it would chew through the stick braced between its front paw and its yellow rodent's teeth, just as soon as its slow mind remembered to complete the bite. Thank you. You've been very patient.